The air inside the Gilded Lily was thick with the scent of expensive saffron and the suffocating weight of a silence that only money can buy. J.C. Puryear sat at the center table, the undisputed son of this dark solar system. He was a man who commanded the room without lifting a finger, his presence alone acting as a gravity well for every nervous glance in the restaurant. At this moment, he appeared calm, his eyes tracing the vintage list on the menu, yet there was a coiled tension in his shoulders that suggested a tiger merely humoring the cage. Across from him sat his fiancée. She was the picture of high society elegance, her silk dress shimmering under the chandeliers, her expression composed and cool. But to a trained eye, she was too relaxed. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and her fingers drummed a rhythm on the tablecloth that was just a fraction too steady for a woman dining with the city's most dangerous man. She was the danger in plain sight, the silent predator Jay had invited to his own table. The refined murmurs of the elite were suddenly shattered by the frantic scuffle of small shoes on polished marble. A little girl, Nara, burst through the ornate mahogany doors like a ghost from a different world. She was a jagged, heartbreaking contrast to the opulence around her. Her dress was torn at the hem, her face was smudged with the soot of the back alleys, and her breath came in ragged, terrified gasps. Before Jay's security detail could even clear their holsters, Nara was a blur of motion. She reached the table and, in a move that made the entire room stop breathing, her small hand swung back and connected squarely with Jay's cheek. The slap rang out like a gunshot, echoing off the gold-leafed ceiling. Jay didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the weapon beneath his jacket. Instead, he slowly lowered the menu, his eyes locking onto the trembling child. In her gaze, he didn't see malice, he saw an impossible, quiet courage fueled by pure terror. Nara leaned in, her small frame shaking against his expensive suit, and her voice came out in a frantic, desperate whisper that chilled Jay's blood. "Don't drink the wine," she breathed, her eyes darting toward the woman Jay was supposed to marry. "It's poisoned. The men in the shadows, they're just waiting for you to fall." In that heartbeat, Jay's world tilted. The girl wasn't the threat, she was the alarm. The target wasn't a rival on the streets, it was the man sitting in the middle of his own kingdom. Jay realized his life hadn't just been interrupted, it had been saved by the very person he was taught to ignore. Stay with us until the end, because when a mafia boss stops being the predator and starts being the protector, the streets don't just change, they bleed. This is a night the city will never forget. The candlelight at the Gilded Lily danced in the reflection of J.C. Puryear's crystal glass, but it provided no warmth to the table. He sat with the rigid posture of a man who lived his life anticipating a strike from the dark, his eyes lowered toward the leather-bound menu as if it held the secrets of a rival's ledger. Across from him, his fiancée, Min-hee, was a masterpiece of manufactured grace. She moved with a practiced, icy elegance, her silk sleeves whispering against the tablecloth as she reached for her wine, her expression so relaxed it felt like a provocation. "You're quiet tonight, Jay," she remarked, her voice smooth and devoid of any genuine ripple. "Even for a man who treats silence like a currency." Jay didn't look up immediately. He was a professional, a man who understood that every handshake had a purpose and every conversation carried the weight of life or death. His life in the Korean Mafia had taught him that the loudest threats were often the ones never spoken aloud. He felt the familiar, cold disappointment of a man realizing that even his most personal milestones were merely business transactions dressed in expensive fabric. To the tourists and business associates dining around them, they were the city's golden couple, the powerful boss and his beautiful bride-to-be, but Jay felt the hollow space between them growing into a canyon. He adjusted his tie, the fabric feeling like a noose. Punctuality and respect were the pillars of his world, and he had built an empire on the certainty that he was always 3 steps ahead of any enemy. Yet, as he looked at Min-hee's composed face, a strange instinct prickled at the back of his neck. The restaurant buzzed with the energy of normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that a shark sat in their midst, wondering if he was still capable of feeling anything beyond the tactical requirements of his last name. The waiter approached with a bottle of vintage red, his hands trembling slightly as he caught Jay's gaze. In this neighborhood, smart people knew to keep J.C. Puryear comfortable, but the air tonight felt heavy, charged with a static Jay couldn't quite identify. He watched the dark liquid swirl into his glass, a crimson pool that looked far too much like the stains he'd spent a lifetime trying to wash off his shirts. He was about to raise the glass to his lips, to toast to a future he didn't truly want, when the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant were flung open, dragging the cold night air into the room and shattering the fragile illusion of his perfect, silent life. The fragile silence of the restaurant didn't just break, it disintegrated. The frantic scuffle of shoes against the marble floor grew louder, a desperate, rhythmic drumming that forced Jay's hand toward the holster beneath his tailored jacket. He was a man of muscle memory, his body tensing for the familiar dance of violence, yet he remained seated, his eyes narrowing as the blur of a small, tattered figure lunged toward his table. Nara didn't hesitate. Before the high society guests could even gasp, before the light of the chandeliers could catch the tears on her face, she swung. Her small, trembling hand connected with the side of Jay's face with a sharp, stinging crack that seemed to echo off every bottle of vintage wine in the cellar. The slap wasn't an act of malice, it was the final, explosive release of a child who had run until her lungs burned, driven by a terror so raw it transcended the fear of the most dangerous man in the city. The reaction from Jay's inner circle was instantaneous and lethal in its precision. 3 of his personal guards, men who lived and died by the speed of their draw, were on their feet before Jay's head had even finished snapping to the side. The metallic slide of weapons clearing leather filled the air, a cold, clinical sound that signaled the end of the evening's civility. 2 men stepped forward, their shadows looming over Nara, while a third placed his hand on the back of Jay's chair, his eyes scanning the room for the men in the shadows he assumed had sent this distraction. "Wait," Jay commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl that cut through the sudden chaos like a blade. He didn't rub his stinging cheek. He didn't look at his stunned fiancée, whose composed mask had finally begun to crack into something sharp and ugly. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the girl who stood before him, her chest heaving and her dress caked in the dirt of the back alleys. He saw the raw, innocent terror in her eyes, the kind of fear he had seen in grown men right before they begged for their lives, but in her, it was tempered by a quiet, impossible courage. The guards remained frozen, their fingers hovering over triggers, waiting for the signal to erase the nuisance. But Jay saw the way Nara's small hands were shaking as she reached out to grab the lapel of his expensive suit, her eyes darting frantically toward the glass of wine he had almost touched. The room held its breath, suspended in a pocket of time where the life of a child hung against the reputation of a mafia boss. In that heartbeat, Jay realized this wasn't an insult to be punished, it was a desperate plea from a soul who had nothing left to lose. Jay's hand moved, not to strike, but to steady the small girl whose knees seemed ready to buckle under the weight of her own audacity. The restaurant remained a tomb of frozen motion, the guards' weapons glinting under the warm chandeliers, yet Jay's world had narrowed entirely to the child clutching his lapel. He ignored the sharp sting on his cheek and the low, indignant murmur from Minhee. He saw only Nara's eyes, which held a raw, desperate terror he hadn't seen since his own early days on the streets. "Speak," Jay commanded, his voice a low, soothing vibration designed to anchor her. Nara leaned in, her small frame trembling so violently that he could feel her heart racing against his arm. Her breath was hot and shallow as she pressed her face close to his ear, her voice a frantic, jagged whisper that cut through the silence like a razor. "Don't drink it," she breathed, her eyes darting toward the crimson liquid in his glass. "The woman, your bride, she put something in it when you weren't looking. A powder that smells like almonds. My father told me about it before they took him." Jay's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He didn't look at Minhee, though he could feel her danger in plain sight gaze boring into the side of his head. The child's grip tightened, her small fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his suit. "And the men," Nara continued, her voice hitching with a sob she was trying to swallow. "The men in the shadows outside, they aren't your guards. They're waiting for you to get sleepy. They said if you don't fall soon, they'll come in and finish everyone." The mention of the men waiting for him to collapse sent a surge of cold adrenaline through Jay. He realized in that heartbeat that his perfect life was a carefully constructed stage, and the curtain was about to fall. Nara's revelation shifted the entire dynamic of the room. The small collision had become a tactical lifeline. Jay slowly looked up, his expression unreadable, a mask of Arctic calm hiding the lethal calculations already spinning in his mind. He glanced at Min-hee, who remained composed, her cold expression now tinged with a flicker of something that wasn't quite fear, but a dawning realization that her secret was no longer safe. The target wasn't just him anymore, it was the truth this girl carried. Jay's hand tightened on Nara's shoulder, a silent promise of protection that he hadn't planned to give, but now found he couldn't break. The night the entire city would never forget had just begun. Jay remained motionless, his hand still resting on Nara's trembling shoulder like a stabilizing anchor. He did not look at the wine glass, though its presence felt like a ticking bomb between him and Min-hee. To the rest of the room, he was simply a powerful man dealing with a minor, albeit shocking, disruption with his trademark Arctic calm. He needed to verify the child's claim without tipping his hand, for in his world, a premature move was as fatal as a late one. "A frightened child with a vivid imagination," Jay said, his voice smooth and conversational, though his eyes remained fixed on Nara with a lethal intensity. He looked toward Min-hee, offering a faint, ruthless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It seems our dinner has become a theater. Min-hee, dear, your glass is nearly empty. Allow me." He reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, designed to look like a gesture of gentlemanly care. Instead of picking up his own glass, he picked up the bottle of vintage red and began to pour into hers. He watched her closely, searching for the danger in plain sight that Nara had warned him about. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible stiffening of her jaw, the way her composed mask flickered for a fraction of a second as the dark liquid swirled. "Actually," Jay continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "this vintage is too fine to drink alone. Why don't we switch? A tradition from my father's time, sharing the same spirit to ensure a shared future." He slid his own untouched glass, the one Nara had pointed to, toward Min-hee and drew her glass toward himself. The silence at the table became a physical weight. Min-hee's cold expression didn't break, but her fingers, which had been so steady, suddenly tightened around the stem of the glass Jay had just handed her. She didn't raise it to her lips. She didn't protest. She simply sat there, the too relaxed smile finally vanishing to reveal the sharp, predatory reality beneath. In that digital silence, the betrayal was confirmed. Jay felt the familiar, cold rage rising in his chest, the same lethal focus that had built his empire and destroyed his enemies. He realized Nara was right, his fiancée wasn't a partner, she was an executioner. His hand tightened on Nara's shoulder, no longer just to steady her, but as a silent signal to his men. The perfect life was over, and the counterstrike was about to begin. The flickering candlelight at the table was no longer a romantic glow, it was a countdown. Min-hee looked at the swapped glass, her composed mask finally shattering into a jagged, ugly expression of defeat. The digital silence between them was punctured by the sudden, sharp buzz of a phone vibrating on a nearby table, and Jay knew the window of psychological warfare had slammed shut. Through the ornate mahogany doors, the men in the shadows had seen enough, the target wasn't falling, and the poison had failed. A heavy, muffled thud echoed from the foyer, followed by the panicked cry of the maitre d'. Jay's eyes didn't leave Min-hee's as he felt Nara's small fingers dig deeper into his shoulder. The silent wolves were no longer waiting. The first window shattered, raining diamonds of glass onto the expensive marble floor, and the refined energy of the gilded lily evaporated into a scream of pure, raw terror. "Tony! Marco!" Jay's voice roared over the burgeoning chaos, no longer a whisper but a command that carried the weight of an empire. His guards didn't need the signal, they were already moving like shadows through the smoke. From the darkness of the street, muzzle flashes strobed against the drawn curtains, stitching a line of fire across the dining room. The business associates and tourists who had been living normal lives just moments ago scrambled under tables, their forks paused mid-air as the reality of Jay's world crashed through the walls. Jay lunged across the table, his hand catching Minhee's wrist before she could reach for the small, shiny object hidden in her clutch. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Minhee," he growled, the cold rage in his chest finally finding its focus. But he couldn't stay to finish the dance, the building was being flanked. Nara's shallow, rapid breathing was a frantic drumbeat against his ear, reminding him that the stakes had changed. The mahogany doors burst inward, and 3 figures clad in tactical gear and matte black masks stepped into the light, their weapons raised with clinical precision. This wasn't just a hit, it was an execution. Jay scooped Nara into his arms, shielding her small frame with his own, as the air filled with the deafening thunder of gunfire and the smell of cordite. The rescue mission had begun, and J.C. Puryear realized that to save the girl, he would have to burn his kingdom to the ground. The dining room of the Gilded Lily had become a killing floor of shattered crystal and splintered wood, but J.C. Puryear moved with the lethal, measured precision of a man who owned the chaos. With Nara clutched tightly against his chest, her small face buried in the lapel of his suit, he didn't reach for his weapon to join the firefight. Instead, his mind raced through the building's layout, calculating angles of fire and intervals of reloading with clinical intensity. He was no longer the predator hunting for blood, he was a fortress, using his own body as a shield against the strobing muzzle flashes that lit the smoke-filled air. "Stay low, Nara," he growled, his voice a steady anchor amidst the deafening thunder of gunfire. He pivoted behind a heavy oak sideboard just as a spray of lead stitched a line of holes across the plaster above them. Across the room, Tony and Marco provided a relentless base of fire, their movements synchronized to draw the silent wolves away from Jay's position. Jay watched the lead assassin's silhouette, noting the slight pause as the man swapped magazines, a 2-second window of opportunity that was the only invitation he needed. Instead of charging the exit, Jay kicked over a heavy marble-topped serving cart, sending it hurtling toward the center of the room as a rolling distraction. As the assassin's fire shifted to the moving target, Jay lunged toward the narrow corridor leading to the kitchens, his broad shoulders shielding Nara from the rain of glass shards. He moved like a shadow through the darkness, his hand guiding Nara's trembling frame with a gentleness that would have shocked anyone who knew his reputation. Every step was a calculated risk, every breath a promise to the child who had saved his life. A mercenary stepped from behind a service door, his weapon raised, but Jay didn't hesitate. He didn't fire to kill, he slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, using the momentum to throw the attacker into a stack of crates, creating a temporary barricade in the narrow hall. Jay realized that in this night of betrayals, his true power wasn't in the blood he could spill, but in the life he could preserve. As they reached the heavy steel door of the service exit, he felt Nara's shallow, rapid breathing begin to steady against his neck. The perfect life was burning behind them, but as Jay pushed into the cold night air, he knew he had finally found a purpose worth the weight of his last name. The cool night air of the alleyway should have been a reprieve, but it tasted of ozone and treachery. Jay did not keep running, he stopped just outside the heavy steel service door, Nara still tucked securely against his chest, her small hands clutching his lapel as if it were the only solid thing left in a world of ghosts. He turned back as the door creaked open once more, and Minhee stepped out, her silk dress torn and her hair disheveled, but it was her eyes that had undergone the most violent transformation. The danger in plain sight was no longer a riddle, it was a screaming reality. Her composed mask had finally shattered, leaving behind a jagged, predatory face that Jay barely recognized. She stood before him with a small, matte black pistol leveled at his heart, her breath coming in sharp, shallow hitches that mirrored Nara's own fear. "You were never supposed to leave that table, Jay," she spat, her voice no longer smooth and cool, but a frantic, jagged edge that cut through the silence of the alley. Everything was set. The empire, the transition, the peace, it was all mine the moment your heart stopped beating. Jay looked at her, his expression a mask of Arctic calm that hid a familiar, cold disappointment. He realized that the woman he had intended to marry didn't just understand the weight of silence, she had been the one tightening the noose. He shifted his weight, shielding Nara's small frame entirely with his own broad shoulders, his body acting as the human shield he had promised to be. "You think power is about the seat you take, Minhee," Jay growled, his voice a low, vibrating warning that seemed to vibrate in the very brickwork around them. "But you forgot the most important rule of our world, you never touch what is mine." Minhee's hand trembled, the too relaxed confidence of the restaurant replaced by a raw, desperate panic as she heard the distant sirens and the tactical movement of Jay's surviving crew closing in. The realization that her secret was out, and her leverage had evaporated like morning mist, turned her face into a mask of pure, unadulterated hate. She pulled the trigger, but Jay had already moved, a blur of motion fueled by the quiet courage of the girl in his arms. In that final, explosive moment of betrayal, Jay didn't just see the end of his marriage, he saw the beginning of a night the city would never forget, and a transformation that had been decades in the making. The alleyway erupted into a strobe light of muzzle flashes and shattered glass as Jay lunged for the black sedan idling at the end of the corridor. Minhee's shot went wide, burying itself in the brickwork, but the silent wolves were already pouring out of the restaurant's rear exit like a flood of shadows. Jay threw Nara into the back seat, shielding her with his body until the door clicked shut, his hands steady despite the cold adrenaline coursing through his veins. He didn't check for damage to the vehicle or his own tailored suit, his mind was locked onto a single calculation, Nara's survival. He slammed the car into gear, the tire screaming against the wet asphalt as he tore onto the main boulevard. Behind him, two dark SUVs swerved into pursuit, their engines roaring with a predatory hunger. Jay watched them in the rearview mirror, his expression a mask of Arctic calm, but his heart hammered a frantic rhythm that matched Nara's shallow breathing from the footwell. "Stay down, Nara," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating anchor in the storm. "Don't look back." The pursuit intensified as they reached the bridge, the city lights blurring into long, neon streaks. A hail of gunfire shattered his rear window, raining diamonds of glass onto the expensive leather interior, but Jay didn't flinch. He had built his empire on the value of his property, his cars, and his territory, but in this heartbeat, he realized it was all hollow weight. He swerved the sedan with a lethal, measured precision, intentionally clipping a row of parked cars to create a wreckage-strewn barrier for his pursuers, sacrificing his own vehicle's structural integrity without a second thought. He drove with a raw, focused desperation, pushing the engine until it screamed, ignoring the smell of burning rubber and the rising smoke from the hood. Every screech of the frame was a small price for the quiet courage of the girl who had saved him. As he performed a narrow, high-speed weave through an oncoming convoy, he felt the familiar weight of his lonely life falling away. He wasn't just a boss protecting his assets anymore, he was a man who had finally found something more valuable than all the power he'd accumulated in 37 years. The SUVs began to fade into the distance, lost in the chaos he had left behind, and for the first time in a decade, J.C. Puryear breathed as if the air actually belonged to him. The neon glow of the city felt different as Jay pulled the battered sedan into the hidden garage of a secondary safe house, the engine ticking like a dying heart. He ensured Nara was safely tucked into a quiet room with a glass of water and a warm blanket before he stepped back into the cold, clinical reality of his empire. The time for defensive maneuvers was over, it was time to excise the rot that had nearly claimed his life. Jay stood before a bank of monitors, his expression a mask of Arctic calm that hid a lethal, burning purpose. He didn't raise his voice as he began the systematic dismantling of the conspiracy, his fingers moving across his phone with the precision of a surgeon. Every lieutenant who had looked away when Minhee poured the powder, every guard who had been out of position at the Gilded Lily, and every associate who had whispered with the silent wolves was marked for removal. "Tony," Jay said into the encrypted line, his voice a low, vibrating growl that carried more menace than a scream. "The accounts in New York and the warehouse on the docks, freeze everything. If they aren't with us by sunrise, they don't exist anymore." He watched the data streams flicker as his loyalists moved through the city like a scalpel, cutting out the danger in plain sight with a speed that left his enemies no room to breathe. This wasn't just a purge, it was a reclamation of his territory and his name. He felt the familiar weight of his power returning, but it no longer felt like a burden of hollow silence. It felt like a tool, a means to ensure that the sanctuary Nara now slept in would never be violated again. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, the silent wolves had been scattered and Minhee's influence had evaporated like morning mist. Jay sat in the quiet of the safe house, his hands finally steady after a night of blood and betrayal. He realized that the greatest threat to his empire hadn't been an external army, but his own detachment from the human elements of his life. He had cleaned his house, not just of traitors, but of the indifference that had almost made him a ghost in his own kingdom. He looked toward the door where Nara was sleeping, knowing that for the first time in 37 years, he was protecting something that truly mattered. 6 months had passed since the night the chandeliers fell at the Gilded Lily, and the city had settled into a new, quieter kind of order. J.C. Puryear sat in his garden, the morning sun warming the slate tiles of the patio, a stark contrast to the cold, digital silence that used to define his world. He was still the boss, his empire more secure and disciplined than ever after the purge of the danger in plain sight, but the lethal, arctic calm that once made him a ghost in his own life had softened into something with a pulse. Nara sat across from him, her tattered dress replaced by a bright yellow sweater, her face no longer smudged with the soot of the back alleys but glowing with the simple, radiant peace of a child who knew she was safe. She was focused on a sketchbook, her small hands moving with the same quiet courage that had once driven her to slap the most dangerous man in the city. Jay watched her, his eyes no longer slightly down or heavy with the weight of anticipated betrayal. He finally had something worth looking at that didn't involve a tactical calculation or a blood-stained ledger. "Look, Jay," Nara said, holding up a drawing of a large, sturdy tree with deep roots. "It's like the one in the park. It doesn't move, no matter how hard the wind blows." Jay offered a genuine smile, a gesture that no longer felt like a practice transaction. He realized that real strength wasn't about making people fear his last name, it was about ensuring that the people he loved never had to be afraid again. He had spent 37 years building a kingdom of shadows, only to find that its true purpose was to act as a sanctuary for a girl who had seen through his mask. His phone buzzed on the table, a message from Tony regarding a business meeting, but Jay didn't reach for it with the frantic urgency of his old life. He remained in the moment, anchored by the laughter of the girl who had saved him from his own indifference. The perfect life he had once tried to manufacture had burned away, and in its place, a meaningful guardianship had taken root. As he watched Nara return to her art, J.C. Puryear knew that while he would always be a man of power, he was finally a man of purpose. Sometimes the most important appointments in life are the ones you never planned for, and for Jay, that appointment had begun with a slap and ended with a home.